Hello, and welcome to another episode of No Franchise Fatigue Presents The Good, the Bad, the Weird, and the Wild. This is your monthly podcast where my co-host and myself pick out one cinematic figure and then debate over our choices from their filmography for the various categories. Good, bad, weird, and you guessed it, wild. My name is Matt Reifschneider, and I'm joined by my brother from another dimension, my co-host, Sean Caylor, who may or may not be from another plane of existence and transforming hideously right before my very eyes.
That is a very impolite way to say I need to lose weight.
I can only tell you so many times before I got to get creative with it. So, but tonight we are, man, we're having a fun night already. This is going to be an interesting show because we're going to be talking a lot of weird shit tonight because we are chatting about one of the godfathers of weird cinema, Stuart Gordon. And we're talking particularly about him as a director, not as a writer or as a producer, but as a director. So it does limit down his filmography a little bit. It's both shocking and not shocking to see that his filmography isn't as big as I thought it was. For some reason in my head, I thought that he had a much bigger filmography, but it's mostly because of his writing and his work as a producer. So, some of his, particularly later on in his career throughout the 90s and early thousands. So, I don't know, like
briefly, born in 1947, Stuart Allen Gordon was American filmmaker, theater director, has screenwriter and playwright. So he also had a very, and this is something I learned fairly recently, but he had a very deep connections with theater. And that's actually where he got almost all of his actors from. So Barbara Crampton and Jeffrey Combs both actually come from stage and were directed by Gordon before their film debut. He went to the University of Wisconsin, and basically after moving to Chicago, he founded and led the Organic Theater Company, as I said. Eventually, like friend and filmmaker Brian Usna, he turned his obsession with H.P. Lovecraft into an extremely successful film career, and like he said, was one of the absolute masters of weird horror. Going from that little biography, what was your first exposure before we start getting into it, would you say?
For me, the Stuart Gordon, he was always a big part of, especially my growth as a horror fan. The movie Re-Animator just was an immediate classic. I remember when my brother picked that up on DVD. I believe it was a really nice Anchor Bay DVD back in the day. And I remember we watched it, and of course, I was much too young to watch Re-Animator, as I'm sure most of us were as we watched it. But what I always enjoyed about Stuart Gordon and why he became one of my quick favorites, both, and you mentioned Brian Usna being his longtime producing friend, and then also a director in his own right. I always appreciated their ability to just balance weirdness with humor and horror. Like there was never like kind of a place that they weren't willing to push boundaries on, and there's a lot of stories from his youth, as a director of being arrested for one of his shows, his theatrical showings, being arrested for showcasing depravity and things like that, so there's a lot of interesting history that he has here, but I appreciate that he was never afraid to kind of push boundaries. And I think for me, it bred a lot of creativity in his work, even when his work is mostly based off of previous IP, whether it's H.P. Lovecraft or Edgar Allan Poe, whatever that might be. He always has kind of a tendency to remix and restructure kind of this classic old horror into a modern way that I think is just really refreshing. I don't know. I mean, I'm a huge fan myself. Are you a fan of Gordon overall, or?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I will roll my answer for that right into my choice for the good, which, as you briefly touched upon, is actually H.P. Lovecraft's Re-Animator. So this is an easy choice, I know, and it is incredibly low-hanging fruit, I know. However, having recently rewatched this after Gordon's tragic recent passing, of course, rest in peace, rewatching it is a reminder of how excellent this movie actually really is. It's sharp, it's funny. The effects are next level for the era. It's also it sketches out, and kind of the main point I'm touching on for my rundown for the good is within it. It sketches out one of the most interesting characters in all of horror in Dr. Herbert West. This film version, deeply modernized and kind of treated as more of a Frankenstein story actually than the zombie movie it appears to be, is a man of pure obsession. Even as the Re-Animator films got out of Gordon's hands and kept going, this aspect of his character has always remained true. It's really the skeleton upon which this series hangs, is that characterization of West as a man who is so obsessed with unlocking the key to immortality, all else is meaningless to him. Human contact, friendship, people, everything he does for the pursuit of his science and his science alone. It's actually a fascinatingly amoral villain in the franchise because he's not evil. He's not an evil man, and that's something that's always fascinated me about these movies.
Well, and not only that, but I think Re-Animator, I mean, as you mentioned, this is, I'm putting this in quotes, quote unquote, his debut film. I know supposedly he has a TV movie before this, but he really does come out of the gates slam banging, with this movie, in terms of his style, the way he approaches filmmaking. But you're absolutely right. Re-Animator puts a lot of names on the board as a film, not only his, but also Brian Usna, as previously mentioned. Barbara Crampton comes out of this film, along with Jeffrey Combs. And all of these people become instant, almost overnight horror icons. And that's a big statement to make for somebody's quote unquote debut film, that to be able to do it.
Not to mention at that specific point in the 80s, even.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. And you make a good point about Herbert West being kind of an interesting character. And I believe the reason we kind of came to Stuart Gordon for this episode was that I had pitched to you possibly doing a Re-Animator, No Franchise Fatigue episode. And because it is a fascinating franchise in its own right, because your main protagonist is not the hero.
Yeah.
It's a movie about the people around him that kind of get sucked into it. These actual more heroic or good people that get sucked into his weird world. And I feel like that's a really interesting parallel to even like Stuart Gordon's career. This guy, who makes these very strange films, and he pulls in these people and creates these monstrosity of films that are both funny and great. But it's interesting, and it makes you wonder if in some way that Stuart Gordon and Brian Usna relate themselves to Herbert West in that way. Because I know you're an H.P. Lovecraft fan. I don't know if you've read the story, Herbert West Re-Animator, but it is much more like a Frankenstein-esque story, and in a lot of ways about the atrocities of war as they end up on the front lines of World War One, him and his partner. But this movie takes it, and it's interesting to see how Stuart Gordon sets the landscape for how to interpret H.P. Lovecraft in a way that if your mind can't interpret it, then it might be funny. And that's how he approaches it. And it's kind of fascinating that's Re-Animator is a film that does that. But I do think that it is kind of the quintessential Stuart Gordon film, which is weird to think that it's like his first major film is the one that defines his whole career, but it really does. And I think it's a great choice for the good, because that's what it does. It sets the foundation for everything to come after it.
Right. And how about you? What would you call his best film, or your good at least?
Good. My choice for this is actually very fitting that this is where it comes, because it's actually his follow-up to Re-Animator, and that's From Beyond, where I feel like Re-Animator does set the foundation for it. He even pushes it further with From Beyond, which is another adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story. Basically, he re-teams up with Barbara Crampton and Jeffrey Combs, and he gets a couple of other kind of major stars. Ken Foree is in this film. to be in this, and it's both weirdly a more intimate film in that it's essentially a one location film. There's parts in the ending where they go to a hospital, but it's a much more intimate film, which almost makes the atrocities that it showcases, these weird concepts of another dimension laid on our dimension, even more bold and strange. And while there was so much love heaped onto Color Out of Space this last year as an HP Lovecraft adaptation, Color Out in Space, when I saw it, I was just like, oh, this is From Beyond but modern, because it uses even the same purple pink color as From Beyond regularly uses. And I don't know, I just love From Beyond because it is what Re-Animator did. It's just further with it. And I kind of appreciate that he's like, oh, you thought that was weird? Wait till you got this. And to think that it's essentially his second film and he's already pushing boundaries even further is kind of awesome.
Yeah, for me, I actually only saw From Beyond for the first time. I just saw this for the first time in a little marathon one of my friends hosted when right after he passed. And this movie is fascinating. I don't know if I really agree on its object quality per se, but there's a lot of interesting stuff happening here. The effects are really, really good. You can tell it's the same team from Re-Animator. And I do like the basic idea of using technology to touch something you don't understand and the consequences thereof, uncontrollable though they may be, because they become addicted to using this technology to continue touching this place. And as they continue to do so, it's almost a parable of addiction, this story. And that is kind of fascinating as well, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it is kind of the perfect partner for Re-Animator, because a lot of the things that Re-Animator talks about, this idea of playing God, or making sure you write cohesive notes to your roommate about their cat's death, that From Beyond is kind of takes those same themes and just kind of parallels with them, as you said, this idea of like playing God by pushing your own bodies and addictions to a place, with the glands that start to grow from their heads. And the more they use this machine to see things, and how the machine, this idea that the villain of the film is like lost in another dimension. So the villain is not a threat unless you let him be a threat. And I think that's kind of clever. And I'm like, there's just a lot of stuff, as you said. Yeah, maybe not the most cohesive of his films or tightly written, but I think the bold swings that it makes really do, for me, put this strictly right onto the good. So that's how that goes. But by all means, let us talk about the hardest category of this podcast, and let's hear what you have to say for the bad.
So, this is a movie I don't personally like, and it is one of Gordon's many sci-fi movies, and that is the immortal Stephen Dorff classic Space Truckers.
That monotone delivery really sells me on it.
It's basically the story of these truckers who are duped into carrying these like deadly super like war bots, and in the course of them getting rustled, they activate, and then they have to try and stop the war bots from destroying it. This movie is just, it's, as we said, picking a bad is not the easiest. This is kind of supposed to be a light, fluffy, pointless space adventure fun comedy. And really, its biggest problem is that for something that I'm 90% sure released theatrically, this plays like a sci-fi movie, and not even like 90s era. I mean SYFY sci-fi movie.
Yipes. Also, I appreciate that you mentioned Stephen Dorff and not Dennis Hopper.
You know what? Dennis Hopper's had enough sadness on his resume. We can just let this one slide.
Fair enough. Also, rest in peace, Dennis Hopper.
Absolutely, but he played King Cooper. Wasn't that enough?
That's true, right? Okay, fair assessment on that one. So,
Well, I do have a weird love for the Dorff man. If we ever do a Good, Bad, Weird, Wild, someone will hear me rant about the series 13.
I feel like we should, because I have this weird love for the movie fear.com. Don't do a spit take. Don't do a spit take. Yeah. For the audience out there, Sean, I feel like I gave Sean possibly a stroke.
I was taking a sip of water, you son of a bitch.
I knew I had to throw. That's why I waited for it. Did you hear how long I paused for it? I was like, oh, I gotta wait for him to drink some water and then yell at him to not do a spit take.
So, have you ever seen Space Truckers?
I have, but I haven't seen it since it came out. When was that? Late 90s? 90? I don't even really know off the 97. Is that what you said?
97, 98, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think so.
96.
I remember renting it. My brother and I rented it. I believe we rented it from the video store. I remember watching it then, and I'm not even sure I finished the movie, which is one of the reasons I wouldn't choose it for the bad, because I never had a chance to actually finish it. But I understand it's a film that's completely and utterly forgotten. I remember bits and pieces of it distinctly, but I do remember it being like a sci-fi movie, and it wouldn't shock me if it was made for TV, even though I do believe you're right. It did get a theatrical release. It's not a movie I actively go and revisit. In fact, I haven't revisited it. Even I did a Stuart Gordon marathon of all the films I own when he passed away, and there's like 4 films I don't own of his, and this happens to be one of them. So I highly agree why it's in the section for the bad for you. And I wish I could agree with you more, but it's not a movie I remember.
I mean, yeah, I already put it all on the table. I don't feel the need to kick this while it's down. It was like you said, this is no need to kick this while it's down. It's completely forgotten to history. This is actually the most it's been talked about possibly ever.
I would probably agree. Nobody else has ever talked about Space Truckers that much. So, yeah, so it is kind of a forgotten film, which is why, like, my choice for
yes, what is your choice for the bad?
the bad? Now, he obviously has made worse films. Space Truckers, I would argue, is definitely a worse film than my pick. He also made a couple of family-friendly movies that are, I guarantee you, worse films. But I wanted to provoke some controversy with my choice for the bad, and throw it out there that I actually am not a fan of Castle Freak.
Wow. Castle Freak, famous full moon feature and full moon featuring dong.
Yeah. Monster Dong.
I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Shit, more male nudity in films. I'm all about it.
Oh, yeah, you know what? I have no problem with that, actually, so that's fine. The MPAA is the one that has a tendency to dislike male nudity.
Problem with that. And this is a movie that has distinctly 2 cuts, so do you have a particular cut you dislike more?
I don't love either. Not truthfully, I just don't. Now, the reason...
frivolous movie, I'll give you this.
Yeah, so here's the reason why I don't like it. Because when I was doing my Stuart Gordon, addiction, in high school and in college, when I was watching all of his films and whatnot, you watch his films and you're like, man, he does such a good job with Barbara Crampton and, all of that cast and Jeffrey Combs and everything. And he does this movie with Full Moon called Castle Freak. And, you look at the original cover for it and you're like, this is badass, And you watch the movie, and unlike the other films, I love From Beyond, and From Beyond definitely pushes limits. This film pushes limits, but doesn't have the knack that Stuart Gordon has to give things levity. Like, there's just not that sense of humor to this movie. This movie's dark and it's heavy.
The entire backstory being based around Jeffrey Combs' character having killed one of their children in a drunk driving accident, and it's also, what's funny is, as much as this is almost a proto torture porn kind of gore porn and weirdly S&M forward movie. But on top of that, it's also like this really serious and almost like heartbreaking secondary drama about this marriage falling apart.
Yeah, and when you have this idea behind, yeah, this really heavy kind of dissolving marriage, and like their daughter is also blind from the accident that the dad put him in, and then you like put this in because like this monster in this castle that they're staying at that he inherits, right, is killing. They accidentally let him loose, and the monster starts killing people. And there's like a scene where, Jeffrey Combs' character cheats on his wife with like a prostitute, and then the prostitute gets killed and he gets blamed for it. You're just like, this is just so dark and so heavy. And it's not that it's bad, because I actually think that Stuart Gordon delivers the film that he wants to deliver. It's just not the kind of film that I necessarily look for to Stuart Gordon from. And even when he does get more serious, like later on in some of his like aughts films, when he starts doing thrillers and things like that, he always has this sense of levity or lightness to his directing that I think is completely void in Castle Freak. And for me, it just makes it kind of a hard watch. And I've seen it a handful of times, and God bless them, they're remaking the film, which I'm really curious to how that remake is going to look.
I didn't know that.
Barbara Crampton's producing the remake.
Interesting.
And
Wow.
it's being made for Fangoria, for their new film label.
I actually just recently reviewed their first release off of that label, I believe. Porno, I believe, was a Fangoria release, actually.
It is a Fangoria release. Yeah, they've released a handful of them now. I think their first one was Puppet Master Littlest Reich.
Oh, oof.
Right, which I did not give a favorable review. And when I reviewed that movie, so
I'm a longtime Puppet Master fan and defender. So, I mean,
I'm waiting for the day that you try to pitch me on Puppet Master, because that's like a franchise that I do not love, and like
I want you to sit there and pretend I haven't pitched that 3 times now.
You did? I'm sorry, I don't remember. That went one in out the other. It's almost like those crazy little puppets. Okay, let's get back on track.
Weird. My weird. Okay, so weird is a topic we've kind of bounced around in a whole bunch of ways, and my angle on this one is actually just because it's weird. And that would be the Christopher Lambert classic Fortress.
God bless you.
Fortress. I like this movie. I'm really not using the category to bash it, but it is kind of an objectively weird future where you're not allowed to have a second child. Christopher Lambert and his wife have this like stillborn child, so they're trying to sneak through and have a child anyway. They get busted and go to like this just super prison, and it is insane. They have like magnet boots, and it's like super brutal. There's like a prison rape scene and all kinds of really harsh, kind of, again, dour movie. But on top of that, it's all this weird sci-fi because it's like an oppressive 1984 style government with constant CCTVs and psychics and all kinds of crap just thrown at the wall and to see what sticks in this movie. Have you? Obviously, I'm going to guess you're seeing Fortress.
I adore Fortress. Now, I haven't seen Fortress in a long time, and that's because the Blu-ray for this movie is out of print, and I sold my DVD a long time ago thinking that I would get the Blu-ray eventually, and then it went out of print, and now I haven't had a chance. And it's a movie I keep thinking that somebody's going to release like this ultimate ultra version of it, like Arrow Video. Or
it's one of those movies you always feel like is more fondly remembered than it is when it's remembered at all.
And then get this, the movie is not available to stream anywhere, not even to rent. So when Stuart Gordon did pass, I was going through and I'm like, God, you know what? I really want to rewatch Fortress. I loved it, growing up. My brother and I used to watch this over and over again. And I wasn't able to. So I haven't seen this in a long time. But that being said, this is a fascinating movie. And you have to admit that the combination of Christopher Lambert, Kurtwood Smith, and Jeffrey Combs might be one of the greatest trios in 90s action movie of all time. It's incredible.
And this is, of course, Kurtwood Smith coming right off of RoboCop and Lord, Lambert would have been just coming off of Highlander 2, so let's just scoot right past that.
That's a franchise we should cover. Put that one in your back pocket. Yeah, we'll get to that eventually. Now, there is a fascinating thing. I was watching an interview with Stuart Gordon once, where he talked about the making of Fortress, and I just want to pitch this to you because I do love this movie. It is the quintessential like early '90s sci-fi action film. Back when sci-fi action films weren't just Transformers movies and various iterations of that.
Running Man and
yeah, these great sci-fi. Running Man is the perfect example. Total Recall is the perfect example. And that leads me into this, was that in this interview, Stuart Gordon said originally Arnold Schwarzenegger was supposed to star in this, in the lead role. And oh my God, like, I just feel like that an Arnold Schwarzenegger version of this movie, nothing against Christopher Lambert. I love him. Like, let's talk about Night Moves sometimes. That is an incredible film. But, nothing against him, but if you would have had Arnold Schwarzenegger in 1992 in this movie would be an instant icon kind of film. And that's just testament to how good the movie is on its own. It just weirdly didn't have that hook for an audience for it to be, that movie that lasted forever. And it's a shame because it's a perfect choice for the weird because of that, because it's a great film that just never quite made it.
Yeah. That's true. It's kind of forgotten, boy, and maybe for another one of our weekly segments someday. But I'm not even sure this ever got a sequel.
It did.
Did it?
Yes, and weirdly enough, Fortress 2 is available to buy pretty much everywhere. So, I'm
completely unfamiliar with the sequel. Interesting.
Yeah, it's not directed by Stuart Gordon, and it certainly is lacking. Christopher Lambert returns for it though, and it was made a long time, like early 2000s, I believe. That's a movie I've only seen once. So I really couldn't speak to it in any kind of way. I remember not loving it. So that's kind of all I've got to say about that.
Regardless, in a filmmaker's career full of weird movies, what is your weird?
Okay, so I'm going to kind of cheat on this one. I think I cheated on our last episode of Good, Bad, Weird, Wild, but I'm going to cheat on this one again too. But my choice for the weird is technically not a movie. It is a movie, but it's not a movie. And that is his episode of Masters of Horror, Dreams in the Witch House.
Okay.
I think Dreams in the Witch House is kind of gloriously strange. Mm-hmm. It is Stuart Gordon flexing his muscles in a format like a television. I mean, it was made for Showtime, so it was not like it was a low budget affair necessarily, but he doesn't have a huge budget. And he uses the gentleman who was essentially the poor man's Jeffrey Combs in Dagon, comes back for this one in Dreams of the Witch House. He doesn't do the shtick like in Dagon, but he's a college student that's studying like astrophysics, and this idea with that. He believes he finds a hole to another dimension in the shitty apartment that he's living in as he's studying in college. And come to find out there's a witch living on the other side of his apartment. And there's some weird fucking shit in this movie. There's a rat with a human face in it. And, this was years before Cats came out.
Yeah, right.
Years before Cats.
Not only do I accept this choice, but I feel it is important to establish at the very least Masters of Horror is okay going forward because, as I've mentioned before, if it ever comes up and we do brave trying to do a John Carpenter episode, actually one of my favorite John Carpenter movies is an episode of the show. So regardless, I accept this choice wholeheartedly, and I'm glad you chose this. I'm a little bummed that probably means we're not talking about his other Edgar Allan Poe episode of the show, which I also think is fascinating. At the very least, if not great, at least fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting is about the show, the show only ran for 2 seasons. It got a 3rd season. I'm putting that in air quotes for our audience out there. It got a 3rd season as a season called Fear Itself, which was then sent to network television. But Fear Itself wasn't nearly as good. And he did an episode for Fear Itself also. But his 2 episodes, a lot of the times in the Masters of Horror, a director would do a great episode and then maybe a weaker episode. I actually think both of his are pretty fucking stellar. I mean, he did The Black Cat. I don't love The Black Cat. Partially because it feels like a stage play. It feels very theatrical. I think Dreams in the Witch House is much more cinematic for his material, but I think he really does knock it out of the park. And Dreams in the Witch House does feel like a film. It could have been theatrically released if it was 20 minutes longer.
For what it's worth, and focusing on the subject at hand, because that was a brief aside, but focusing on the subject at hand, also, not a high budgeted show, higher than standard network television as it was on, I believe, Showtime. But boy, every cent is on screen in this thing. It is a really, like you say, it could have been theatrical easy.
Oh, for sure. I would have totally seen this in theaters. And I actually think that the one weakness of this film is that because Showtime ran hour episodes, that it's only an hour long. Don't get me wrong. I've been watching a lot of movies that are only like 67 minutes long or something to that effect. So it's not like it's inherently out of the scope of things of being a film, but it is kind of short. I wish there was 20 more minutes, but I have to mention when talking about Dreams of the Witch House that the final act is ballsy. I mean, the places that it goes, and I'll try not to spoil it because part of that is the surprise of that episode, but the places it goes in its final 20 minutes are fucking aces. They are so good, and it's the reason why I wanted to put this in the weird is that this is essentially a TV episode that's so good it could have been a standalone theatrically released movie. So that's my choice for Weirdest Dreams in the Witch House for Masters of Horror Season 1. But I guess that leads us into our final category for the evening, sir. What is your choice for Wild Card?
So, in this case, I am choosing to use my wild to speak of my one true love. A movie that has been with me my entire childhood, my absolute favorite Stuart Gordon movie. Maybe not his best, but man, let me tell you how much I love nations fighting their wars with giant robots in Robot Jox. I cannot even verbalize young, 8-year-old Sean's reaction to this movie. The idea of people piloting giant robots to fight each other and then to have that be like a live action movie blew my freaking mind, and in a lot of ways set a lot of my tastes going forward. I mean, my balls out obsession in life is Metal Gear, which is inherently about a giant mech, a more militarized, slightly realistic one, air quotes, but nonetheless, that fascination 100% stems from this movie. This was what even introduced me to the concept of people piloting a giant freaking robot. That's amazing. How about you? You did a little fist pump. What do you think? You love
Robot Jox? How do you not love Robot Jox? Come on. This is, and it's what's interesting is like by 1989, I am not, you are more of the resident anime expert or those giant mech shows and things like that, but by 1989 that was a pretty big genre over in Japan, and we certainly got a little bit of it here in the US through kids cartoons.
Sorry, Robotech, that kind of stuff. Yeah,
right, but the fact to see a live action version of it, and weirdly enough, I feel like Robot Jox is very Americanized version of those kinds of things. This idea of it's almost like Rock'em Sock'em Robots to like a weird degree. But I Robot Jox is also we talk about Stuart Gordon pushing the limits on things. Whose idea is it that there's this guy, he made this weird zombie movie called Re-Animator, and then he made this weird alternate dimension horror film called From Beyond, and then he made a killer doll movie, and then we're going to give him this massive budget to make giant robot warriors beating the shit out of each other. Who's
every cent on the screen? Now, this movie does have very, very long swaths between the robot fights that young Sean didn't have any patience for, and old Sean doesn't have a ton more patience for. Look, the actual world building, the setting here is interesting. You can tell that where they put all their money, and that was in the fights that exist. Some of the plot is kind of a little silly. It's an espionage plot where this other countries trying to steal American secrets. I believe it's Russia, if memory serves, of course, because it was 1989.
Yeah, for sure.
But all of that aside, seeing it again when you're old enough to kind of understand it, it's not the most exciting stuff. It's sort of like taking Star Wars and telling me that you're going to give me 3 movies about galactic politics and call it a prequel. But
Space Congress!
But sort of like you can say, but the prequels do have those lightsaber fights. Well, Robot Jocks does have the giant robot fights, and they are cool. Having it all come down to creative use of high wattage light bulbs in the form of blinders is actually kind of a weirdly believable last ditch weapon, and I've always kind of liked that. Even as a kid, I was like, that's kind of neat that it's not destructive, it's distracting.
Yeah. I think that this movie is, for a movie that, like I said, is not necessarily original, it feels original. And I think that was always kind of Stuart Gordon's way of approaching things, was that he would take previous IP or whatever inspirations and cut it in a way that's really interesting and unique. And I think Robot Jocks is like the perfect example of that. And for a wild card choice, I highly recommend that I second this. This is a fantastic choice for a wild card choice, because it isn't great. Like you said, there's swaths of the movie that are long and drawn out, and also 10-year-old Matt was of that same ilk where the robot fights were great, but the rest of it was a little bit more a hit or miss for me. But I appreciate I probably respect Robot Jocks more than I love it. That's kind of ultimately where I fall on that one. But I know, great choice, Robot Jocks. They made a sequel to this, right?
Say, before I ask you your wild, yes, actually allow me to fully suggest you missed the deep air quote sequel, Robot Wars. Yes. It's one of those movies that was forced into being a sequel. It wasn't actually the intent. It wasn't even shot as a sequel. That was a marketing move.
Yeah, that's kind of what I figured.
Common in the era, of course. Famously, Trolls 2 is the same. Most Italian sequels, the zombie movies.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, that actually makes sense. Every sequel outside of the original 4 for Hellraiser.
Excuse me, Mr. Defends the weird VR in the house one.
Yeah. Hey, the title for that one is Hell World. Thank you very much. Get it straight. Get it straight. Don't you make those rude gestures at me. Jesus Christ. All right, let's talk about my wild choice. And I actually briefly mentioned this before, but I'm going to go with another H.P. Lovecraft adaptation because that's what I'm just leaning heavy into.
Please say it.
Dagon.
Yes.
Let's talk about Dagon. Let's talk about Dagon, baby. Let's talk about you and me.
What you're doing is not to step on your toes at all, and this is absolutely your segment. But
I'm a terrible dancer. Step on them all you need.
My love of this is that you take H.P. Lovecraft's, in many ways, signature story. Arguably, in a cross-media sense, Color from Space is his most famous story, but in a literary sense, this is the proto-Cthulhu mythos. This predates all of that stuff, but this is kind of the prototype for that thing. And to take that and turn it into this movie it's amazing.
It's amazing. This movie's kind of badass. I mean, it's a combination of the story Dagon and Shadow over Innsmouth. But it's a combination of those two, and it's also like it's a Spanish film. It's not even an American, like it's all Spanish financing. It's just a weird movie. But this was, if Stuart Gordon does Robot Jocks, he goes back to horror and he does Castle Freak, right? And then he kind of leaves again and does a lot of kind of weird things. I mean, he produces and writes a little bit of horror. He does The Dentist. He doesn't direct The Dentist, but he writes it.
He directs the first episode of the Honey, I Shrunk the Kids TV series.
Yes, right. He does like some family friendly stuff. And you're like, oh, geez, what's kind of going on with this? And then here he comes back, and he comes back with Dagon. And I remember when it came out, my brother and I, this was kind of in the full swing of things. I would have been about 15 when this came out, 15 or 16. And I remember us being excited about it because, it's Stuart Gordon, the guy who did Re-Animator. So my brother and I like rented from the store, and we're like, okay, so, the CGI is pretty shitty. And, but like, this movie's just so fucking wild that, it's just like fish people. And you have the gentleman from Dreams in the Witch House, who does a kind of a poor man's version of Jeffrey Combs in this film. But this movie is just so weird. And the like use of rain and the use of prosthetics and this just like overwhelming sense of like not being safe at all.
And let us not walk by the monster design. Like, I know you said the aesthetics, but I mean, even on a broader sense, the creatures in this movie are really cool. The fishmen.
Oh, for sure. And then even better is that everybody, when the Pirates of the Caribbean movies came out, the second and third one with the fishmen in it, and they're like, oh, that's so cool and original. And I was like, but Dagon, I was like, but Dagon's got killer fish people. This is cool.
It's like that South Park joke. Simpsons did it.
Yes. Yeah, but no, this movie is it's wild. It's very much a throwback to his early career. And that's kind of what I like about it. It's got a weird amount of jokes in it, a lot of visual gags. It's got a lot of weirdly effective horror sequences.
It's kind of the last of the old guard of that 90s splatter horror.
Yeah. I mean, the scene where the lead character, Paul, is running through the house, the abandoned house, and it's like pouring rain, and he's trying to hide from the fish people, and they're like storming into the house. Feels, I swear to God, just like the Resident Evil video games. It gave me that sense of like that survival horror that he's not trying to beat, he's not trying to win, he's just trying to survive. And that, it just rocks and rolls. And then when they introduce like this fucking fish queen lady, and she's really weird, and you've got like this old drunk guy that's helping him out, and he's really weird. This movie just keeps layering layers of weird upon everything. And between this, the atmospheric tonality and the sense of old school, speed and throwback feeling, I just love Dagon. And yeah, it's not his best. It could be tighter in the writing, and the like I said, the CGI is not very great, but come on, Dagon.
That does it for this segment of Good, Bad, Weird, Wild. How do you feel? Did you like our choices? Do you disagree with our choices? Did we forget to talk about your favorite movie, King of the Ants? Tell us.
Dolls? Did we forget to talk about Dolls? I fucking love King of the Ants. Don't you shit talk King of the Ants. That movie's great. Bleh.
His whole crime phase was a little meh.
Yeah, I think Stuck is great. Edmund, I don't really remember, let's be honest, but Stuck is great. King of the Ants is great. Don't you shit talk this.
Do you guys want to join in the conversation? Am I crazy? Let us know. You can reach us on social media at Twitter.
You can reach us at the handle nffpod on Twitter, and also at Facebook at facebook.com/no franchise fatigue, because that's our mothership podcast.
Also, you can always reach Matt on Twitter at the movie Matt, and feel free to email me personally if you want to at me about King of the Ants at nffpod.sean at gmail.com. Sean being the only four-letter word you're supposed to use.
And not
N.
Also email him at nffpod.ants, A-N-T-S, at gmail.com. I feel like we should make an entire thing just for the swarm of people that are going to be coming for you because of you shit talking King of the Ants. Yeah, did you hear that? Yeah. Also, check out our back catalog, everybody. Check us out wherever you have podcasts. Please rate, review, and subscribe. I know every podcast person says that now. Rate, review, subscribe. We're going to say it too. Share us with your friends. Check out our back catalog. We got some good shit on there. We got a lot of good shit coming up too, Sean. Lots of good shit coming.
Yes, we do. But until then, have yourselves a good evening. And turn the machine in the attic off. You don't need it. You don't need it.
Yeah, I like the purple color. It's a great night light. Thank you so much. Have a good night.